All right, everybody. I'm going to start us off with probably my favorite quote about John Wycliffe, or John Wycliffe, depending on your persuasion. That Master John Wycliffe translated the gospel from Latin into the language not of angels but of Englishmen, so that he made that common and open to the laity and to women who were able to read, and spread the evangelist's pearls to be trampled by swine.
Whoa. Who said that?
That was from Henry Knighton, who was a Middle Ages era historian in England.
Okay.
And clearly a Catholic, and clearly not impressed with our boy today.
Huh.
Yeah.
All right.
So today we're going to be talking about the morning star of the Reformation. That's his little nickname, John Wycliffe, who lived in the 14th century between 1329 and 1384. And the reason he's called the morning star of the Reformation is because he was one of the figures in England that started to really challenge the Catholic Church in ways that the reformers, such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, all those dudes would kind of echo a lot of ideas that he had started. And he's a really interesting guy.
I'm excited.
Yeah. So let's kind of get into it. So I think the first thing to kind of recognize is that John Wycliffe was born into a really interesting cultural background in England. Now, also, for those of you guys who are kind of tuned into the Church History for Chumps cinematic universe, a lot of his story actually overlaps with one of our favorite figures from past episodes, Julian of Norwich. Like, there's actually a time when it's like one of the most pivotal times in his life as far as the things he's going to be preaching and writing about, and it's happening right as Julian of Norwich in her cell is receiving the visions that would go on to be written in Revelations of Divine Love.
Whoa.
So super cool to see the timeline overlap like that.
Crossover event.
Yeah, crossover. I'd love to see the sitcom episode where they like bump into each other on the road and she's like, "Oh, sorry, sir," and she's like, "Oh, milady," and then they just keep on going and the crowd goes wild. So a big thing, as you guys remember from the Julian episode, was the Black Death. This horrible bubonic plague that killed millions and millions of people in Europe, definitely impacted England despite its geographical disconnect from Europe. And so this was a couple decades after the Black Death, just like when Julian was writing her visions. And the Black Death did an interesting thing. Because it killed so many people, it wiped out so many parts of the population that the peasant class had an opportunity for prosperity and for positions in society that they were never had access to before. And so the elites basically responded to that by creating a lot of barriers for them, which created a lot of tension and animosity between the classes. And we're going to get into that because that's going to come to a head. But that was a really big deal in the beginning. There's also this increase of urbanization happening in Europe. People are flocking to cities looking for a better life, and just the number of people that are getting more educated and more literate, that's a big thing happening prior to John Wycliffe's time. And there is an increased level of frustration of the masses opposed to the Catholic Church. So we'll get into his story. Not a whole lot known about his early life. A lot of it is kind of up to guessing. One of the big first things that happens for him that is obviously very, very influential is that he studies at Oxford, which is, even to this day, a very, very esteemed institution. And so he would study at Oxford. He would eventually get ordained and into the priesthood in 1351, and he would kind of hop around to different parishes where he would lead them as their faith leader, And in the 1370s, something really impactful to his life happens as well, which is that he is called upon by the royals in London. And they send him, because he's an educated guy, he's a faith leader, they basically send him as an English ambassador. They send him to Bruges in Belgium, which I think may have still been Flanders at this time, to negotiate with the Pope about taxation and basically the relationship between the king and the Pope. And this starts a relationship between John Wycliffe and the royal family, specifically this dude by the name of John of Gaunt. And if you're familiar, John of Gaunt was one of the sons of the King of England at this time. He played a really pivotal role in near the close of the 100 Years' War, which was between England and France. And this relationship that John Wycliffe started with the royals became a really big deal. And here's why. As John begins to teach, both in the academic and in the realm of his churches, he takes a super oppositional stance to much of what the Catholic Church is doing. And it's not just like, when we tend to think about someone like Martin Luther, it always seems to settle on, his big gripe was justification. John Wycliffe had a dozen gripes. Like, he had several problems with the church. First and foremost, he was heavily influenced in his studies by Greek philosophers like Aristotle, which means that his views on matter and essence were very Aristotelian. What does that mean? It means that he didn't buy transubstantiation. He did not believe that sanctifying bread and wine could suddenly morph it into the body and blood of Jesus without it changing its actual matter. So he just didn't buy it. And what's interesting was, at the time, or like currently, we see transubstantiation as like a very core view of the Catholic Church. But in John Wycliffe's time, it had barely been a century of doctrine.
It's really a new idea, actually.
It was very new. And I don't know if it was controversial at his time, but it was something that the Catholic Church did not like to have questioned. And he was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, this is kind of absurd. He also believed, which was very, very controversial, that when Jesus said to Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, that this was not Jesus proclaiming Peter to be the first pope, and that this was not Jesus giving Peter any more greater power than to any other apostle. So he did not believe in affirming the papacy at all, which is obviously like one of the most like cornerstone views of the Catholic Church. Another thing he believed was that if like you found out that the church owned property that was being misused or not used in a legal way, that the government should be able to take it away. Like, he had this big issue with the Catholic Church and its role in the magistrate. He was basically like the power that the church holds in its governance and in its magistrate powers is a complete abuse. This should not be a thing. And as we'll get into a little bit later, he believed that the texts of the scriptures should not be limited just to the clergy, but that it should be available for everyone. And so he's teaching these very, very radical things that is getting that should be putting a target on his back. Now, here's the saving grace for John Wycliffe. The reason why he was not like immediately, condemned or banished or burned at the stake or whatever is because in the world of the Catholic Church, there's this papal schism going on right now, where there's this weird kind of territorial conflict between Avignon and Rome, and there's like different popes kind of vying for authority. So that's like the number one priority for them.
Kind of makes it an easy target in a way. Like, prior to this, when you have just a very clear lineage, so to speak, of from pope to pope, and a peaceful transfer of authority and power, it's easier to be I think, more confident in the idea of papal authority.
Yeah.
But when they're arguing, and I believe it was at this time, it was around this time, one of the popes is like never in Rome, but he's, in France in a mansion, just like holding like orgies. like if that's what's going on with like the popes or someone who's supposed to be the pope.
It's pretty easy to point out the flaws. Yeah. And I mean, I think a reason why it was also pretty timely this was happening was that it kind of it made it easy to not worry about what was happening in England. So John continued to preach and kind of like build his following. Now, and we'll kind of get into this more later. I think if I had a hot take to make about John Wycliffe, like, Protestants obviously love this dude, and I think it's reasonable. I think there's a lot to really admire about him. I think that we almost embellish like the type of following that he was able to garner for himself, and I kind of feel, just based on the study I was able to do, and hey, if you've got a history degree and you know better, show up in our mentions, man, like, tell us what you think. But I feel like I kind of get the sense that John Wycliffe was an elite who was actually more, because of his connection to the royals in England, I don't think he was that concerned about spreading this like everyman message in the same way that the other reformers were. I think he was kind of an academic who was in his own circle,
Interesting. So it was like more of an exercise of intellectual, like some intellectual beefs, and not so much like trying to start a...
that's kind of the thing. I just don't know how much this dude was trying to start what happened, because I think there were a lot of things that would happen in and around his lifetime that actually sparked more of a movement than he maybe even intended to start. Because in 1376, he's actually summoned to appear before the king, and he's... Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong date. In February 17th, 1377, he is charged with sedition by the church. So he's basically accused of teaching false teachings.
What year was that? Sorry?
This was 1377.
Okay.
And so when he shows up, he basically pulls a power move, and he brings John of Gaunt and a couple of the other royals from the English courts with him, which is totally like a flex of like, oh, well, yeah, if you want to punish me, that's fine, but just recognize there's going to be a lot of consequences you aren't going to want to deal with, because look at my homies here who clearly have my back. And so from what I read, the hearing basically didn't go anywhere because a riot broke out, and then they didn't really resolve anything. There was nothing settled in terms of like the punishment that they were going to have for him. So John continues doing his thing. He continues to preach against more practices. He starts to go in on the idea of indulgences. He starts talking about pilgrimages and how those are wrong. He starts talking about veneration of saints and how that's an unhealthy practice. And I think one of the easiest reasons why we look at him and see a proto-reformer is because he's always coming back to the same conclusion. If this practice does not have a clear biblical foundation, then it is problematic. And I think that at that point in time, it was very easy to criticize the practices of the church for not having biblical foundations, because they were also steeped in corruption. Like, this was also, he was anti-monasteries, and as we both know, monasteries have had serious ups and downs in terms of like when they were fulfilling a healthy monastic call that was deep in spirituality but also wide in terms of serving the community, and times when they were just basically filling their pocketbooks and they were full of corruption.
Right.
And so he's able to avoid the wrath of the Catholic Church for a few more years. Then maybe the most significant event of his life happens in 1381, which is the Peasants' Revolt. And so we mentioned earlier there was a lot of class tension that was happening, because as a large part of it was a result of the Black Death earlier, but there were a lot of factors. And so this preacher by the name of John Ball, kind of leads this revolution, and he's very anti-clerical. He's like accused of like being a socialist. He's like very down with the Catholic Church, down with their magistrate influence and such. And the Peasants' Revolt is just this big bloody affair that takes a long time to put down, and it's just super, super messy. And John is basically accused as being like, oh well, like these people are following your teachings because they all feel entitled to having the scriptures in their language, and they're all very anti the authority of the Catholic Church, which really couldn't be the case because their leader John Ball was teaching like a decade before John Wycliffe ever even started teaching. And also John Wycliffe often preached against the type of violent overthrow that the Peasants' Revolt stood for. And again, John Wycliffe's associations were with the elites. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the people that they were looking to throw down were John Wycliffe's best friends. And that's kind of what leads me to think that I don't know how much of John Wycliffe's like movement was for the people as much as a like academic theological assertion. After the Peasants' Revolt,
Can I just make a side note?
Yeah, go for it.
They killed the Archbishop of Canterbury in that revolt.
Oh yeah, I think they beheaded him, right?
Yeah, like to me that shows like how far along it got that they were able to take down the Archbishop. Reminder, this is before the Church of England, so like this is still a Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, and they smoked him. Yeah,
which is this was not just a small little thing. This was pretty brutal. And so in the aftermath of that, John Wycliffe did what many people have known him for, and what my quote from the beginning of the episode referenced. He sat down with many of his educated associates, and they translated the Bible from Latin into Middle English. And
which would mean that most people who were literate at all could read it? Is that what Middle English would denote?
So I mean, Middle English was just like it's kind of like the step between Old English and what we have today. So you can look at Old English and it's like a lot of the V's or U's and stuff like that, and I'm sure it would have a very distinct accent and such. But
side note, I didn't know this was a thing. Recently my wife showed me a video, not a video, an audio recording of C.S. Lewis reading. It was either Middle English or Old English out loud. And it's like listening to like an elf or something.
Dude,
like,
it's very like it's very like Lord of the Rings meets gibberish.
Yeah.
it's so strange. Yeah. It was probably Old English.
Okay.
So he translates the Bible. This was this monumental thing, and like I said, the opinion of the Catholic Church was that maintaining the church scriptures in Latin is preserving their holiness, and that you're actually making them kind of vile, and like literally the term was vulgar if you're translating them into a common language. Like, the quote that I read from a Catholic historian was spreading the evangelist's pearls. Evangelist capitalized because it's referring to Jesus, spreading the pearls of Jesus to be trampled by swine. Like, it was inappropriate for the scriptures to be common or to be accessible to the people.
Which kind of reveals kind of where their doctrine of scripture was in the first place.
Oh yeah. And so Wycliffe, to a lot of people's surprise, was never fully persecuted because of his. He was always kind of able to slide around and not be persecuted for his faith. And eventually, he had a pretty bad stroke in his like mid-50s, and he was never able to recover from that, and he died, I think, within a week of it. So John Wycliffe's influence would go on in the the form of these followers called the Lollards, which we referenced briefly a few episodes ago. We also referenced that. Just what a name, the Lollards. Really sounds like an insult. And
it was, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. So no one's really quite sure what the etymology of that word is, but it's possible it was it's like the Dutch word for mumbling. And I think the idea was because they were always reading the scriptures, it was like, oh, look at those dummies mumbling to themselves. And so if you ask an uninformed, like, wannabe historian like myself, I would suggest that the Lollards were not so much a direct result of John Wycliffe's teachings and actions, but I think they were, it was a combination of John Wycliffe's teaching giving fuel to the unrest that was started by the Peasants' Revolt. I think the Peasants' Revolt was a very, like, everyman kind of, like, F the church, they don't represent our interests, they're always putting us down because they're the man. And then John Wycliffe was able to be like, well, let me articulate very clearly what the issues are with the church, and they kind of took that and ran with it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a super insightful thing to note. Something I think that we try to make a theme on these podcasts is that every instance of church history, whether we're talking about a person or a council or anything, there's always cultural underpinnings to it. Like these reformers and these proto-reformers like John Wycliffe didn't just drop out of the sky, like the Holy Spirit didn't just like insert like these Reformation ideas into their mind and then they have an epiphany and they go from there. No, there's like tons of cultural background going into this that's pushing both them and, like you said, it's providing fuel to cultural fires that were already there.
Yep, exactly. Like we believe the Spirit of God is active and moving throughout all the realms of history, but it's moving. It's not moving independent of history. It's moving through the wheels of history, and that's what's actually so fascinating about it. And so the Lollards come up. Now, I think maybe my second hot take about this is that the Lollards were dope, but there are some who I think might want to take a more revisionist approach to seeing this proto-Reformation movement and say, oh, well, the Lollards were basically reformers already. Like, this was the English Reformation, like already starting to take root. Here's where I think I would disagree with that. The Lollards were super informal. The Lollards really didn't have any structure to what they were doing. The Lollards were literally people who were among the middle class and the town folk. There were no Lollard churches. There were no Lollard confessional like pieces written until basically the very end, right before they were snuffed out by the Catholic Church through heavy persecution. And literally what they were people who would meet in secret with copies of the English Bible. They would read and have like little informal Bible studies by themselves, and that was pretty much the extent of what they did. Eventually, as their persecution kind of heightened, they would release the 12 Conclusions, which is kind of like a cool little prelude to the 95 Theses, because I think that just like the 95 Theses were nailed to... where were they nailed? Like, was that in Worms?
No, that was where he was tried later on.
Right. Where did he nail the 95 Theses?
Why do I want to say Wickenburg?
I think you're right. That sounds really right.
95 Theses was Wittenberg.
Wittenberg, okay, yeah. All right. So I want to say the 12 Conclusions were nailed to the door of the Westminster Abbey, which is pretty hardcore. And again, the 12 Conclusions reflect a lot of these same reformational ideas. They are suggesting things very true to what John Wycliffe had said, which were things like transubstantiation is like superstitious and not biblical. They were saying things like prayers for the dead are not biblical. Pilgrimages are steeped in superstition and not valuable. Confession isn't good because the only confession you need to make is to Christ himself. They would say that the church was often overly emphatic on making beautiful art pieces and architecture, and not committed enough to things that actually stand for virtue. They interestingly had a view about battle and the Crusades, where they were almost came across as pacifists. Where I'll see if I can try to find a quote here from their conclusion, where they say, the 10th conclusion is that manslaughter by battle or law of righteousness for temporal cause or spiritual without special revelation is expressly contrary to the New Testament, which is a law of grace and full of mercy. So they were basically like, all these religious wars that keep being fought, specifically with Christians attacking what were functionally infidels, was wrong. Like, we should not be engaging in these types of battles because it doesn't reflect a love for our enemies. And so yeah, the Lollards would continue to kind of do their thing in secret. They would eventually release a tract called The Lantern of Light, which would express more of their beliefs. They would kind of have stage a military revolt called Oldcastle's Revolt, which would get put down pretty quickly. And then in the 1500s, they would continue to decline. The cool thing is Lollardy was still around when the English Reformation did take off, but it was definitely not a big enough force to have sparked the English Reformation by itself.
So one thing that I notice about the Lollards when we're comparing them to later reformers, and even Wycliffe when we compare him to later reformers, is like, what exactly is the emphasis, or what's making them want to pursue this? Which, by the way, the 95 Theses was in Wittenberg, which is in Germany, and when we look at like what Luther was doing and what Calvin was doing, I feel like those guys, there's something like a little bit more personal. Like Luther, we'll talk about him one of these days. That guy had a lot of like just personal angst about his own justification, and that led him to the theological conclusions he made. What strikes me about Wycliffe, to me, it doesn't come across as wrong. It's just a different emphasis. But he seemed to be more caught up in like the power dynamics of like, you know, the power centers of England versus the power centers of Rome. And a lot of what he seems to be attacking is the way those power dynamics play out in the church itself, whether it's through the priesthood and or how they're using the sacraments. And so it's actually more of it's a little closer to a political movement, which doesn't automatically make it bad, because the church was so bound up in politics, just as it always has been. But it wasn't quite kind of bubbling up from this internal crisis like we're seeing with Luther. It's like you've got a guy with power who's going, you know what, I don't like how the Pope and everything downstream from that is working right now, so I'm going to challenge that. Yes, and I think so. I read a little bit about the Catholic perspective, the modern Catholic perspective on Wycliffe. And what's interesting is that, and this is why I kept referencing John's connection with the royals in England, because their perspective is basically like, well, this dude was just he was a shill for the King of England. Like he was just he was a pawn of the royals, because they were butting heads with the Pope about who had the supreme authority over their political spheres. And so when you look at someone who's very critical of John Wycliffe, they basically say, well, yeah, he was just being like the
used.
CIA.
Yeah. He was a Fed. Yeah, he was just a Fed playing for the king and queen. Right. Like, and they discredit him as a result of that. Like they'll say, well, yeah, of course he was vouching for his friends because he was given all of these privileges and opportunities because he was buddy with the royals in England. So that's why he was so anti-clerical. But it's not because he had a strong theology, which is I can't say it's a valid criticism because I think that his theological assessments were correct, but you kind of have to take into consideration the relationship he had with those who benefited a lot from anti-clerical theology.
Sure. Yeah, something that struck me with Wycliffe is, so he wasn't. Were you going to talk about what happened after he dies?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll wait to talk about my point. I want to talk about like the fear of excommunication, what that would mean actually, as opposed to like kind of how we might think of it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, he's so. I want to say it was about 30 years after he died. He is formally condemned because of his teachings. He's excommunicated, and they actually dig up his body and burn it.
I love when they do that.
And then they scatter his ashes in, I don't know, like a garbage bin or something, like the city dump maybe. And that's their official way of being like, hey, it took us a while to get back to here, but F you.
Which, if I understand how they understand excommunication, essentially what they see themselves as doing is like snatching him away from wherever he would be. Like if he had made it into heaven or into Abraham's bosom or whatever, like not anymore, because we have retroactively excommunicated you.
Sure.
I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure like that is what, like if the church, and here's what the point I wanted to make, like to be excommunicated from the church pre like Reformation, like that's like a really big deal. Like that is essentially the church guaranteeing that you're going to hell. Like it's not just something that we would like when we think about excommunication in even our own churches. What that all that is for us is the church saying, we don't believe that you're a Christian right now, and so we're not going to treat you like you're a Christian or have expectations on you like you're a Christian, and we're going to pray for your repentance, and we're happy to receive you back into fellowship. For them to like attack the papacy and to make all of these claims that could potentially get you labeled a heretic and be excommunicated, it's like playing with your own salvation. Yeah. Which I think is hard for us to get into that mindset because of how easy it is for us to be critical of anything we want and there not really be like tangible consequences most of the time.
And it's a great way, like you're saying, to deter people from challenging the authority, because if you know that I mean, it's like when Jesus said, don't fear him who can kill the body, but fear him who can kill the body and then cast their spirit into hell. Like in this place, that's not God Jesus is talking about, it's the church. Like the church is the one who kills the body and casts into hell, which is kind of an indication that maybe that's a level of authority that the church wasn't supposed to wield at this time or at any time.
In a way, it does bring a measure of like security and peace, I think, during when Christendom was at its height, that people were able to see a direct connection to like their relationship with the church and the relationship to God. And I want to be careful to not make those things be completely separate. There's no such thing as loving Christ and not his bride. For these people, though, like I could see how it would be a lot easier, like we said earlier, if you had ideas that you never really wanted to say out loud, but then you found out that the Pope was up to some shenanigans, you'd be like, okay, I'm just going to say it now. Like, I'm not so worried about like my salvation when I'm pretty sure that this thing is corrupt at its core.
Yeah. I also kind of wonder, I've never read anything that affirmed this, but the fact that like burning at the stake kind of has this double purpose, because one, it's a very painful way to die. They probably saw it as a reflection of hellfire, which they were sending that person to, but it destroys the body. And like, as we know, cremation was frowned upon as a means of disposing of the body. Like burial was what was supposed to happen to Christians. So the fact that they dug him up and burned his body, there was like that was a punishment, you know, like to have a cremation rather than a Christian burial was shameful.
Do you know were they under the impression that would make the resurrection not possible?
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah. I mean, like, I'm sure they would probably say that cremation, or that, like, the state of the body doesn't, like, stop the resurrection for faithful
all the
believers.
That were martyred.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's, like, it's like a statement, you know? I feel like it's kind of like I don't know. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I do think there is a balance here, because I feel like because he had such reformational theology, like, prior to the Reformation, he does get a little bit of hero treatment. And I think one thing that we've done pretty well on our podcast is, like, we don't, like, no fanboys, you know. We don't treat anybody like they're superheroes. Everyone is still very much a person as a part of history, just like we are today. But yeah, I don't know.
No, I think you did a good job of kind of drawing a balance between, like, he was saying a lot of true stuff. Were all of his motivations 100% pure? Of course, we can't know that, but it is helpful to understand the historical context surrounding it. I also think it's cool to see, I think in Wycliffe it's even more apparent, because he never did leave the Catholic Church, to see that, like, that never was, for any of the reformers, that was never the goal.
Right.
They always wanted to truly reform, not replant or start something entirely new. And I appreciate that when we're looking at reformers, is understanding that for all of the ones that we love, like, they loved the church and they didn't want to leave. But when you're being threatened with death, sometimes you do other stuff.
And it just makes you think too, dude, like, when the Catholic Church built out their theology of the papacy to basically make him not just, you know, I know a lot of Catholics take issue with how Protestants interpret papal infallibility, so I'll avoid that altogether, because I don't think I'm that informed on it. But when you think of how the papacy was established as an ecclesiastical, is that the right way to say it? Ecclesial, jeez, that sounds so dumb. As an ecclesial authority and a political authority, it's like there was no way dissent. Like, you've officially removed the possibility for any healthy level of dissension, because at the core of John Wycliffe's views were this idea that the Pope should not have the authority that he held, and there's no way you can say that without functionally committing treason. And there was no way he was going to avoid getting his bones burned, either alive or dead. The reformers, the 30 Years' War was always going to follow the Reformation. Like, there was no way, once it had gotten to this point, to have a clean break. And that's why I think the tension, there were so many centuries of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics.
Which I think would lead into, which one of these days we're going to have to do an Abraham Kuyper podcast.
Shoot. Yeah.
I don't know if we've talked about Kuyper before, but Kuyper is actually pretty massively foundational to a lot of how John and I kind of understand just spheres of authority in the world. But one thing, like, if you're interested in learning about it, like a Kuyperian understanding of authority would be one in which we understand that God has given different types of authority to different types of groups, the state, the church, the family. And we just see when you get the wires crossed on those things, bad things happen. Yeah.
And it's just like, I don't know, like we think about how we hope, because, like, as much as we love to celebrate so much of the beauty of church history, but there is a tragedy here. And I think that even if I was sitting across from a Roman Catholic right now, I think we'd be able to agree, like, the bloodshed that happened in coming out of the Middle Ages was tragic. Like, the level of fear in religious contexts because of people that we would now consider brothers in the faith, just from a different tradition. Like, that's a tragedy. And yeah, I think I wonder how much of that was avoidable, but then I guess, the whole believing in providence says that, well, nothing is truly ever avoidable. We're always just experiencing the unfolding of God's perpetual will.
One thing it highlights is just that ideas have power. And so many times when we're talking about people at this time in history, I think we kind of paint these caricatures of them based off what their followers picked up the ball and ran with. That's so true when we jump forward a century and we're looking at the followers of Luther and Calvin and all of the religious wars that unfolded in between Lutherans and Calvinists and Anabaptists and Catholics, and it's just a mess. And I think that it just highlights how ideas really do have power. It's one reason why I'm like honestly not a huge fan of how easy it is for people to just publish whatever's on their mind these days as I'm speaking into a podcast microphone. Like,
don't say that too loud, man.
I understand the irony, but oh my goodness, like we need to think through it. Ideas are worth bearing out and thinking through. And it just makes me think of our buddy Brad, who we've had on the podcast, and his kind of emphasis on like the ability to think out loud and to say things without fear of consequence, which sounds like the opposite of what I'm saying here, but really like if you have this like perfect vacuum where like there's no room for talking about ideas, this is where like the wars start and the blood starts shedding. And so again, my favorite concept that came out of these Reformation days was the idea of reforming and always reforming. We should always be asking the question of like, how can we return to truth in our praxis?
And like I want to say for our listeners who maybe jumped on this episode because of John Wycliffe and his kind of heroic status in this in your tradition, and you might think, oh, well, praise God for John Wycliffe who brought orthodoxy back to the church. Around the time that John was first being summoned to the throne of England to connect for the first time with the royals, this was when Julian of Norwich was receiving her visions that would become written down and have a tremendous influence on both the Catholic and later on the Protestant church, and how we began to see God and particularly Christ as extremely nurturing and affectionate and loving. So while we can see a reformation stirring in the hearts of the Lollards and these proto-reformers who were bringing back an ecclesial orthodoxy, I also want to say that I think Julian and many of her contemporaries were restoring a form of orthodoxy and just seeing the affections of God for his people. And that's not something a lot of Protestants are comfortable saying, because obviously these people were very steeped in their Catholicism, but that's kind of what our whole podcast is about, is seeing the Spirit of God wherever he goes. So maybe
a little side note to kind of maybe wrap all the way back around to that quote you read at the beginning, is a contemporary of Wycliffe. So Wycliffe died in 1384, so not quite a contemporary. So he dies in 1384. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. I have his date right here. Yep, 84. Okay, 1384. Johannes Gutenberg is born in 1393, just a few years later. If you know anything about Gutenberg, this guy changes the world with the printing press. And what we're going to see then over the next century, and this is so critical for like the Reformation even happening at all, is the possibility of the Word of God not only being translated into language that more people can read, but just getting it into more people's hands. And I am definitely a Protestant, and I see a lot of good coming from the Word being dispersed in this way, just because I believe what God's Word says when it says that that his word will not return void.
Yeah.
That there's going to be fruit that comes from his word being proclaimed all over the world. And so we're starting to see like this major shift in history here. I think we should kind of continue in this theme of like this couple centuries to kind of connect some dots here. What do you think, John?
I think that's a great idea, dude.
We should talk about Gutenberg, maybe talk about the Waldensians.
Because remember, listener, like, We've said this 1,000 times and we'll say it 1,000 more. The most important history is not the history that occurs while you're alive. It's the history that you're born into. And John Wycliffe was born into a history that was starting to grow increasingly distrustful of the authority of the Catholic Church. And that pot did not simmer down until it exploded in the Reformation. But he contributed to that. And yeah, it's fascinating to think about. I have one last fun fact for you, Thomas. Are you ready?
Let's go.
So after the Oldcastle Revolt, which was the last big uprising of the Lollards, the English Catholic Church actually started to release these like statements, kind of this anti-Lollard propaganda, and they would hang up these signs that said, "You loll by the sword, you fall by the sword."
Are you serious?
No.
Oh, you got me. Because that's something you would say, which is why it was your joke. But I was like, what? These were your guys, man. You loll by.
I mean, if I read that's a point for Catholicism to me. I'd be like, I don't want to loll by the sword. Oh, man. All right, well, guys, that's all we've got. Thanks so much for listening. It's been a blast, and we will catch you guys next week. God bless.
God bless you.